Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of Exploring Daniel when God Invades a Broken World. And in this session, we're going to look at the mysterious time references that occur throughout the book, and there are several of them. We have the reference to 7 times in chapter 4. It's repeated various times. We have a reference to time, and half a time, and we find that in chapter 7 and again in chapter 12. And then, of course, there are the many references to 7 and 70 in chapter 9, 70 years in 9:2. And it's broken down into 77s, 7 sevens, 62 sevens, the middle of the 7. So we have a lot of 7s to discuss in chapter 9. And then we have reference to mornings and evenings in chapter 8 and days in chapter 12. And then we have the ubiquitous phrase, time of the end. It occurs a half a dozen times throughout the book. So what do all these time references refer to? How are we going to get our arms around them? Well, let's take a first look, shall we, at the big picture. There are really 3 pictures of time, if you will, or 7s. We have the very prescient image, if you will, in chapter 4 of the 7 times. Remember the image of Nebuchadnezzar, the tree that is cut down, and the heavenly interpreter through Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that this is an image of him, that he will be cut down to a stump. And it turns out that references a time of judgment that is 7 times. Interpreters think perhaps maybe 7 years, we don't know, but it's a time of judgment for his failure to recognize that God is the true king of the universe. This image of judgment repeats itself throughout the rest of the book. And in the beginning of that important chapter 9, we see a reference to the 70 years of judgment. It grows a larger period, if you will, and it's a judgment on God's people for their failure to recognize who is their king and their God. And then later in chapter 9, that 70 years is expanded to 70 times 7. So the key here is this idea that there is a period of judgment, and the 7 suggests an ever-expanding period of judgment because of the people's failure to see God as God. So that's the big picture, and it comes together in chapter 9. 9 is the key, the image, the structure that is put together here. It is the framework through which the other time references run. And in that chapter 9, there is a focus on the end. Collectively, all these time references, they push us towards the end. That final period, that time of the end, we have a middle of the 7, times and a half a time. The evenings, the mornings, the days, they're all talking about an end. So clearly there's a message here for Daniel to look forward to what's happening in the future. And so we're going to focus on that throughout our talk today. So then, as we look at chapter 9, we see that it contains both a prayer and a vision. And both of these occur in what we're told is the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes. You'll remember from our earlier sessions that this is an important transitional year in the life of God's people. It is the year in which Cyrus invades and conquers Babylon, sets up the Persian Empire, and it anticipates the next year when he will allow the Jewish people to return to their homeland. But it is this event, this invasion, which prompts Daniel to pray. He's reflecting upon the prophecy of Jeremiah, which set this period of judgment at 70 years. And by Daniel's calculation, this period should just about be up. And so he cries out to God. He says at the end of that prayer, "For your sake, my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name." He's pleading for God to act on behalf of his name. The world is not speaking highly of God, is doubting their God because he has neglected, apparently, his people and his city. So Jeremiah has predicted, and Daniel is now praying for the restoration of both the city and the people. So in response to his prayer, God sends his messenger Gabriel, and Gabriel gives him this very enigmatic and meaningful response. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. A glorious fulfillment of everything that is promised to God's people. It will take 77s for that to come to pass. Well, in the following verses, it turns out that 77 is broken into sections. It talks about 7 sevens followed by 62 sevens. So you put that together, that's 69 sevens. And then we have the very last 7. And most of the activity, most of the description, most of the prophecy all centers around that last 7. We see that in the other chapters. The other chapters anticipate the fullness, if you will, of the activity around that last 7. In Daniel chapter 7, we see that last 7 broken up and expanded upon into a time, times, and half a time. It's like an ever-expanding story, if you will. First you have 7 sevens, 62 sevens, then the last 7, but then the last 7 opens up into a time, times, and half a time. So the events described in chapter 7 kind of squeeze in to this last 7. Likewise, you heard in Gabriel's response about the restoration of his sanctuary, right? Well, in Daniel chapter 8, we see a prophecy about that restoration, and we are told that it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings for that sanctuary to be restored. If you look at a calendar and you try to work that out, that's somewhere between 6 and 7 years, let's say. But that phrase, evening and morning, it takes us back to the story of Genesis. We are told that the world is created in 6 evenings and mornings. And then the 7th day begins, but it never seems to finish. So is there a relationship here between the 2,300 evenings and mornings, that 6+ years it will take to restore the sanctuary, or the 6+ times? Is there some relationship to that? And the 6 evenings and mornings there in creation? Well, we'll have to look into that, won't we? And then the last time we see this intersection is in chapter 12. It's reflecting back on what is said in Daniel chapter 9. And there it's put in terms of days. 1,290 days that the people will be oppressed. But blessed is the one who lasts beyond that, who lasts 1,355 days beyond the end, if you will, of this last 7. So you can see just by this brief casual look, a brief glimpse of these other prophecies, they all center around this last 7, the all-important last 7, as we find it in chapter 9. And now let's look at that enigmatic phrase, time of the end. It occurs 6 times in Daniel, twice in chapter 8, twice in chapter 11, and twice in chapter 12. In chapter 8, Daniel's told that the vision of the ram and the goat, it concerns the time of the end. And then 2 verses later, the statement is expanded. Daniel hears, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. And at this point, the messenger explicitly identifies the kings of Media and Persia as the ram, the 2 horns of the ram, and the goat as the king of Greece. Somehow these clear historical references then have to fit somehow in our definition and understanding of the time of the end. In chapter 11, things change a little bit. In verse 35, we're introduced a section that appeals to a change that's happening, that while the wise stumble, God is working something to refine them, purify them, make them spotless until the time of the end. For it will still come at the appointed time. Well, what does that mean? I mean, it's a time of the end when the wise will become purified? What does that look like? Is that in history, or is that somewhere out in the future? 40, it looks like we have a clear historic reference. We are told about a battle that will happen at the time of the end, where the king of the south will engage the king of the north and will storm out with chariots and a cavalry and a great fleet of ships. Was this talking about a future historical battle, or is that talking about a battle that has already happened in time? At the time of the end there, it seems to be a little more enigmatic. And the last two phrases occur in chapter 12, and then we are told that Daniel is commanded to roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. So that's clearly somewhere in the future when this scroll will be unfurled. And then later we are told in a similar way, go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. And then we have a reference that sounds a lot like what we heard in chapter 11, that many will be purified, made spotless and refined. But the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. So is this reference to a future time where people will be purified? Bottom line, I think, is this reference time of the end, it seems to refer to different things on multiple levels. There's a sense in which what God reveals through the kings of Media and Persia and Greece, they're all part of his view of the end. But that end seems to extend for a period of time, and it also points out to future struggles, future conflicts that ultimately ends in the finalization of all things and the purification of those who are striving to be faithful. So we need to keep an eye on that kind of growing interpretation, if you will, of the time of the end. Now that we've looked at this framework of 77s as we see it in Daniel chapter 9, and we've looked at some of the other mysterious time references as we find them throughout the rest of the book and how they plug into this framework, let's think about interpretation. How do we get our arms around what this framework really means? Not surprisingly, we have a difference of opinion. As we saw last week, when it comes to the images, the same sorts of differences exist here when it comes to interpreting these 77s. Some see that framework pointing to the time of Antiochus, the desecration of the temple around 167 BC. Others see this time frame referring to Christ and to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Some see it as including a reference to a future period, 7 literal years, that last 7, it's still out in the future. And still others see everything as a symbolic reference in some way. So let's step back and let's look at the evidence. And we'll begin at the beginning. Where do we start? In Daniel chapter 9:25, we read that the whole period of 77s starts from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Well, when does that happen? Well, it kind of happens at multiple periods, multiple times in history. Some have proposed it happened very early at the time of the destruction itself under Nebuchadnezzar, 587, 586 BC. We don't have an explicit reference, but I'm sure we can assume that people were calling for the temple to rebuild as soon as it was destroyed. We do, however, have an explicit call to rebuild during the time of Cyrus. It's the time of Daniel. It's the very year that he receives this vision in 539 BC for the people to return and rebuild the temple. Later, we have a decree from Artaxerxes I for Ezra to go back and continue the rebuilding of the temple. And that same ruler will authorize a letter later to Nehemiah to return, 445 BC, and complete the walls there in Jerusalem. So all of these potential starting points have been offered by various interpreters. But then we have the second problem. Which anointed one are we talking about? In Daniel chapter 9, also in verse 25, we have an explicit reference to an anointed one who will come, and that this anointed one will be cut off just before this last 7. Well, which anointed one are we talking about? Some have proposed it's a reference to the high priest, Onias III, 171 BC. Last week we heard about Onias, that it was Antiochus IV who was behind his murder. Still others, of course, see this reference to Jesus, the Anointed One, the meaning of the word Christ, and his crucifixion around 33 AD. This clearly is the interpretation that the NIV, for example, takes. They capitalize that phrase, Anointed One, there in their translation. So these are two different interpretations offered to that reference to the Anointed One. And which desolation are we talking about? In chapter 9, verse 27, we see this reference to an abomination that causes desolation, or abomination of desolation. Various interpretations of this have been suggested, but clearly it refers to something going on with the temple. Something happens that desecrates the temple and causes the temple no longer to be a place of worship. It's now desolate. Well, which activity are we talking about here? Which is referred to in this framework? Well, some again point to the desecration of the temple under Antiochus IV Epiphanes that we referred to last week around 168, 167 BC. And some point to the outright destruction of the temple in 70 AD under the Emperor Vespasian and the General Titus. Certainly the sacrifices stop then. There is no temple. It is a desolation, if you will. And still others point to a future desecration of the temple that is yet to be rebuilt. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. We still don't have a temple in Jerusalem, but some interpreters expect it to be rebuilt. And when it is rebuilt, there will be another desecration at that point. So again, multiple interpretations of what desolation, what abomination is being described here in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. So those are all the particular starting points, marking points in the calendar. But does this all work in history? Can we tie these events to particular dates? Interpreters who wish to find this framework in history convert the 77s into literal years. So if we do the math then, 77s would be the equivalent of 490 years. 7 sevens would be the equivalent of 49 years. 62 sevens would be the equivalent of 434 years. And if you add that together, we're talking about 69 sevens or 483 years. That marker is important because in Daniel chapter 9, a lot of events happen right around that 483, that 69-7 mark, just before we get into the last sevens. And is that last 7 a literal 7 years? Well, to get our arms around that, we also have to think a little bit about what calendar we're using here. In our culture, the sun determines the beginning and ending of months and years. But that was not the case in ancient Israel and in ancient Babylon. There was some combination of a lunar calendar and a solar calendar, mostly a lunar calendar though. And there was also sacred calendars as well as secular calendars, calendars that started a sacred year in a different time that secular calendars started. So different ideas here, and some interpreters have argued in particular when it comes to this kind of apocalyptic literature, prophetic literature, there's a prophetic calendar out there, and they look at scriptures like Revelation 11 and 12, and then references in Genesis 7 and 8. The idea here is that there's a perfect lunar calendar consisting of 360 days per year, 12 months, each with 30 days in them. So when we're talking about Daniel's calendar, if we're talking about a perfect 490 years, then it's 490 years of exactly 30-month days. That creates some sort of tension because nobody worked on that calendar. I mean, it's an idea, it's an ideal. Everyone understood in that day that there had to be an adjustment period. Extra months were usually added to a lunar calendar to account for the differences in seasons. But nonetheless, we have this challenge of which calendar to use. So for the sake of just having a conversation, we're going to admit the 360-day-a-year calendar just so we have somewhere to begin. So if we allow this assumption of 360 lunar days per year, let's put this on a timeline and see if it works. Well, it turns out as soon as we do that, we do observe some historical challenges. If we start with the 490-year period, no matter where we start from and end with, we still have a challenge. Remember, according to Daniel 9, we start with that call that goes out to repair and rebuild. And it ends with this desolation, this abomination of desolation, desecration. So how does that work on a timeline? Well, if we start with Cyrus and the call to return Jerusalem around 539, and we measure out 490 lunar years, that brings us somewhere around 56 BC, and we're not aware of any desecration or abomination that occurs at that point. Similarly, if we start later with the time of Ezra and his trip to Jerusalem with exiles to rebuild the temple, again, if we measure out 490 lunar years, we get around 25 AD. Again, no noticeable abomination of desolation or desecration. Similarly, we start at 445 BC with the call of Nehemiah to return and rebuild the wall. Again, 490 lunar years later, we're somewhere around 38 AD. Again, no appreciable notice of desecration or desolation. And by the way, if we switch to a solar calendar, get closer to 365 days a year, anywhere between 360 and 365 days a year, we're still not hitting a mark as far as a historical distance between any of those starting points and a noticeable abomination of desecration. So what if we look at the other figure, 483 years, that important break between the 69th and 70th seven? Is there any noticeable historical mark here? Well, you remember in Daniel 9, the reference there is to the cutting off the anointed one. Can we see an anointed one being destroyed or cut off in that period? Well, again, if we start with Cyrus, it doesn't seem to yield a result, because then we're somewhere around 63 BC and we're not aware of any event that measures up to that. If we start with Ezra around 458, that takes us somewhere around 18 AD. And again, Christ was alive there, but he's living in Nazareth at that point. Is there a mention there of an anointed one being cut off? No, the only time we come really close in any of these historic markers is if we assume that the starting point is with Nehemiah somewhere around 445 BC. And then if we add 483 lunar years, we're somewhere in that area of 31 AD. And about the time of the beginning of Jesus' ministry, some people point to his baptism, the arrival of the Anointed One, his crucifixion around 33 AD. So that's the only point on this whole map where we're getting somewhere close to history if we start with Nehemiah and get to the period of Christ. So if we're going to see history here in Daniel chapter 9, it seems like this is the only alternative, and we have to make several assumptions. We have to assume that it is starting with Nehemiah. That's the starting point Daniel sees. We have to agree that the anointed one to which Daniel refers is Christ. And we kind of have to assume this somewhere we're talking about a lunar calendar of 360 days per year. Some interpreters look at these historical challenges as a clue. They see that there's only one historic calculation that seems to work, and that is if we assume that we start with Nehemiah and get to the period of Christ. But that only gets us to the end of the 69th seven. Where's the 70th seven? How come nothing in history can be compared to that? Well, earlier sessions, we referred to the dispensational view, the view that sees a future fulfillment of 7 literal years. For these folks, there is a break, a gap between the 69th and 70th 7. The plan of God with his people who descend from Abraham is on hold until the 70th 7. Right now, we are in a period in between what they call the church age. It is the time that God is working his plan for the Gentiles before he continues his plan for the Jewish people that will consist of that 7-year tribulation. So that's one way to handle these historic challenges, by interposing this gap between the 69th and 70th 7. Now, the text doesn't say it explicitly. You kind of have to read it into the text. But interpreters from this school say that you can see it spelled out elsewhere in the New Testament as God focuses upon his ministry to the Gentile people, flowing out of the disciples and through the Apostle Paul. Is this the best way to solve the problem? Well, I'll leave it to you to decide. There's one more perspective here that we ought to examine when it comes to interpreting these 77s. And it starts with a section of the Old Testament. We call it the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the laws of Moses. God builds into the laws for his people this repetition of 7. 7 is an important theme. It's a story of completion that God is renewing and restoring over and over again. It starts with the story of creation, where there are 7 days discussed. In 6 days, evenings and mornings, God creates, but the 7th day begins. It just doesn't end. In fact, we're told that every 7 days, the people of Israel need to remember what God did, reenact that creation, or that 7th day, if you will, in this day of rest every week. And then every 7 years, they do it in a new way, restoring of God's people through sacrifices and celebrations and repentance and all the rest. God is renewing every 7 years. And then we have this reference to a year of Jubilee, which is 7 sevens, right? Every 49 years. And that 50th year is the year of Jubilee. And look at the text there. It comes from Leviticus chapter 25. In verse 8, the people receive this command: count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. So we're given very explicit instructions here. And notice, it seems to me very, very clear that when we're talking about 7 sevens, clearly Daniel is referencing this somehow in this vision that we see given to him in chapter 9. In verse 10 of that same chapter in Leviticus, we read, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family, property, and to your own clan. See, it's a celebration and a return. There's something about this jubilee is about going back to what God did originally. When he brought people in, when he would bring people into the new promised land, as things kind of deteriorated in between the jubilees, every 50 years it has to go back to the beginning, the way God intended it from the beginning. And with this in mind, I wonder if we don't see a new jubilee declared there in Daniel chapter 9. Read again that verse from chapter 9, verse 24. 77s are decreed for your people and for your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy place. You see, there is an emphasis here on returning to what God wanted. This period of desecration, this period of captivity, this period of judgment at the end of Babylon, it's almost over. But God wants the people to go back to where they were when he first created this city, this people, this land. There seems to be a new promise of Jubilee, a new time to return. And it seems to come after what we could interpret as another Jubilee, an historic Jubilee. This is what the Lord says: when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. These are the words of Jeremiah. These are the words that inspired Daniel to pray. There is a type of Jubilee happening here at the end of this Babylonian captivity. The people of God are able to go back and restore what he wanted for them in the beginning. I think if we back up for a moment and look at the big picture, what we see is God working this theme of Jubilee throughout the people of God's history. If we go back and look at the bigger picture, it does start with creation, that 6 days of creation. They're completed. But the seventh day, it starts, but it never ends. It's a new beginning. It's supposed to be an eternity of us with him. But that plan is frustrated when people fall. But God has not given up on that plan. He gives this promise through the law of Moses that he's not given up on this plan. That's the reason for the repeated Sabbaths, the Sabbath years, the 7 years, the years of Jubilee. It's God's constant reminder to his people. He's not given up the plan for the seventh day to have an eternity with his people in fellowship and in righteousness and in worship and in a love relationship with one another and with him. God has not given up on that plan. And twice then through history, and many other times besides, but in particular in the life of the history of Israel, we see God demonstrating that powerfully. First, in that very period where he gives this law, he gives them a new start. He creates them, if you will, by bringing them back from Egypt into the promised land. They are in a different kind of captivity. So he liberates them after 400 years of captivity. He brings them back to their homeland. It is a new time of Jubilee, a new beginning. But then what happens is what always happens after a Sabbath day, a Sabbath year, even a year of Jubilee. People return to what they did before. They begin getting into the 6 days of work week, 6 years of living through life, and they start to sin and fail and repeat the sins of Adam, and they continue to need that restoration at the end of the 70th, at the 7th. Right? We always come back to that need for restoration and restoring work of God. And then we see that same cycle now in the life of Daniel repeating itself. That 70 years of captivity and judgment, it's over now, and the people can go back. But still, we're not back to that promised eternal place in the garden where people were to be restored with God forever. We're left there hanging at the end of the Babylonian captivity. And I believe what's happening in Daniel chapter 9 then is a vision of the future where there's a new Jubilee coming. So from that perspective, what would the plot of Daniel chapter 9 look like? Well, I think what's happening here is that God is reinterpreting the period of the future, the time future from Daniel in terms of 77s, in terms of this Jubilee. When Daniel looks out ahead of what's before him, those 77s, they talk about the rest of time. What's going to happen from Daniel's time on ahead? How will God bring us back to where he started in the garden? And I think that's what we see over the next 77s. In that first 7 sevens, which is interestingly, right? 7 times 7, 49 years, that first instance of Jubilee, if you will, after the Babylonian captivity. I think that's a way of telling us that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. The temple will be rebuilt. So it's on the way to the end. There is going to be a Jubilee. People will be able to rejoice when people come back to the temple. So I think that's happening in that first 7 sevens. That's a symbolic way of talking about the restoration, the Jubilee of Jerusalem and the temple. And then there is the time in between, the 62 sevens. I don't think it's a literal number. That's my interpretation. I think it's just telling us that there's a period in between that restoration of Jerusalem, an indefinite period until we get to that last 7. There will be all sorts of cycles happening that time. Ongoing Sabbaths, ongoing Sabbath years, ongoing Jubilees, yes. But it will be totally different. What Daniel 9:25 tells us, it will be filled with wars and desolation. So that's that long span of history. But then we get to that critical last 7. And what we saw in Daniel chapter 7 is that inserted into this last 7 is a time, and half a time. So it's like this 7 expands to contain a new piece of information. In many ways, it's kind of a expanded and reflected version of what we saw before, right? We have 7 sevens, a fixed small time, followed by a longer time, followed by a small time, this 7 sevens, and what happens in the middle of that 7. Now we get a short time, a time like the Babylonian time, that short period of time, then followed by a longer time, the times, plural, and then we get again to that end, the very end. Well, I think this is where Antiochus comes in. He's that time, if you will. It is that he's within that last 7. That we're in the last phase of God's plan here when we get to the period of Antiochus. And in many ways, what happens under Nebuchadnezzar and the captivity there, it happens again and repeats itself in that first time of the last 7. That story of Antiochus where the temple is desecrated and needs to be restored. So that happens in 167, 168 BC, in that area. That's a marker for God. The people of God, as we've seen before in the last sessions, people see that event and they know God is at work. He's continuing his plan here of Jubilee that he started with the restoration after Babylon, now continuing after the time of Antiochus. But then we enter that period of times again, just like the 62 sevens. Now we're in that period of times, and it's an extended time of more wars and more desolations. That will continue for a period until again we get to the half a time. And that last half a time, it is that middle where something critical does happen. It is that period where the anointed one is revealed. It is where that anointed one is cut off. That anointed one is the key to understanding how this 7 will come to an end. It occurs during the revelation of Christ. And in Daniel 7:13-14, I think that's that bigger message there of times, and half a time. It's telling us very importantly that revelation of the anointed one is the critical piece of truth that we see. There's a declaration here that God's act of jubilee and freedom has occurred. The eternal jubilee has begun now because Christ has come and restored things to the way they were. We're back into the eternity that God promised in that 7th-day creation. It's already begun in Christ. It's just that it has not been fully revealed yet to everyone here in time. So I believe really that's what the story of chapter 9 is about. That we need to look ahead to this revelation of the Son of Man. And when that revelation occurs, rejoice, because the eternal jubilee has begun. Now, it's not been revealed to everyone yet. Not everyone has experienced yet. It will crash into history at the time and choosing that is up to God, not to us. There's no measurement on that. It's when his calendar intersects our human calendar. I don't believe these 9s are meant to describe our human calendar. No, they're God's calendar, and he will act when he is ready. But when he acts, the eternal jubilee will begin. So this, I believe, is the point of Daniel chapter 9. It is stated very clearly in verse 24. It's all about God restoring his people to the place that he wanted them to be in the beginning. It's a restoration of the garden where God dwells in righteousness and fellowship and love with his people. This end, we are told, is sure and certain. It will come through this anointed one. But it'll come on God's time, on his calendar, not on ours. And I invite you to come back next week as we look at this challenge. How do we resolve the tension between eternity and God God's sure and certain plan about eternity and history, the time in which we live, when not everything has yet been revealed. That's our subject as we look at the final chapters of Daniel, chapters 10 through 12. But in the meantime, we pray God's blessing upon you as you continue to serve him.